In terms of what I'm going to say for the rest of these videos, I'm drawing most of the material here from these two books. And if you would like a good book on how to do research above and beyond what I'm going to say in these videos, I definitely recommend these two books. So Kate Turabian, and this is a very, very classic old book, which has been revised again and again and again. It's also the basis of the Chicago style. And it's already now in its ninth edition, revised considerably by a group of scholars. And it's fantastic, a manual for writers of research papers, theses, and dissertations. And then also The Craft of Research, and that book is actually already in its fourth edition. And if you'll notice the names there, it's basically written by the same group of scholars who have revised the Turabian book. So, these two books do in fact contain a lot of the same material, but The Craft of Research contains a lot more as well. Okay, so let's raise the question then, what is research? You're doing a research paper or a thesis, which obviously involves research. What exactly is research? Well, I mean, in some sense, research is that which is done by a researcher, but of course, who is a researcher? Well, in order to answer those two questions, we basically have to consider, first of all, what kinds of questions are being asked, right? What constitutes a research question as opposed to, just a general question, right? Why is, like, what have I got in my pocket? Why is that not a research question, right? Audience roles, so what roles does your imagined audience play for you, and what are your researcher roles in relation to that audience? Okay, so I've made it out in a chart like this, so you can envision whenever you're writing a paper or if you're doing a thesis, you should be able to figure out what your researcher role is and what your audience role is, and then what your research questions are. Right. Once you can figure that out, then you can begin doing your research. Okay. So one researcher role might be something like this. I've found some new and or interesting information about X. So whatever that topic is, I've found something new and interesting about it. Right. So the audience role then would be, oh, that's wonderful. Entertain me, with this new and interesting information. Okay. So then your research question would be, what is new and or interesting about X? And there's nothing wrong with this kind of role. I mean, it's in some sense, it's very straightforward. You're not trying to solve a problem or anything. It's just, hey, I learned something new. We haven't, found this out before about X. Well, isn't this interesting, right? And that's perfectly fine. That is a perfectly fine researcher role, perfectly fine audience role, and perfectly fine research question. Another researcher role would be, well, I've found an answer to an important question. So there's kind of been, it's not just that you've found something new or interesting about something, but there's been a sort of lingering question that's gone unanswered, and I've found an answer to it. So in other words, I can help you not just to understand something more, but I can help you to understand something better about X, right? So the audience role then would be, great, help me to understand this better. Don't just entertain me with something new and interesting, but help me to understand something better, because there's been, question marks hanging over my head, sort of thing. So this is wonderful. And then the research question, this is sort of divided into two. I'll come back to the bottom section in a minute, but the research question would be, how should we think about X, or how should we understand X? Or you could say, how should we think about X in order to understand it better? Something like that. So it's sort of guiding you towards taking a different stance towards X than what has been taken in the past. Another possible role would be, well, I've found a solution to an important practical problem, right? The audience role would then, great, help me to solve my practical problem. And so then the research question would be, well, what should we do about X? And this is where we're going to come back to that blank spot there above. Sometimes, and just like a research paper is not entirely different from, not entirely separate from an analysis paper. Obviously, research involves dimensions of analysis as well. The same thing with these roles. A researcher role isn't just one of these things. There could be a great deal of overlapping. And in particularly in the second and the third role here, there might be some overlapping. So if you found a solution to an important practical problem and your research question is, what should we do about X? Well, to a certain extent, part of your role is going to be, I've found an answer to an important question. I can help you understand something better. Because the associated research question there would be, what must we understand about X before we can know what to do about X? So we've got to be able to do something about X. Okay, well, maybe we have to think about X in a new way before we can figure out how to do it. What we should do about it. And so that second question, if you can see my little arrow going around, this second question right here is what is going to link these two roles together. Okay, so this kind of thesis involving, these two roles and all of these research questions, you're often going to see these kinds of questions and these two roles together in one thesis. And like I said, that doesn't mean that the first role is less important because you're not necessarily solving a problem there. That's okay. And for that matter, you could, in some sense, be doing all three roles because perhaps you've been able to understand X better and therefore solve the practical problem precisely because you found out something new or interesting about X, and that was what helped you understand it better. So there is a sense in which all three roles are going to overlap, perhaps, but they don't have to. You could just have researcher number one, the role number one, and that's fine. You just, it might just be a paper or a thesis for entertainment. That's totally fine. All right. So, but the main thing is figuring out exactly what your research questions are going to be. Okay. And that will help you to narrow you and make it more precise, keep it right on track. Okay. So let's look at, I have an example coming. So let's just sum up here what research is then. It's basically the gathering of information. So you have a set of shared or shareable facts to entertain or to answer a question, help one to understand, or to solve a problem. All right. So that's a good definition of research. Now let's look at an example. So imagine I had a student last couple of years who did this topic for a master's thesis: snake handling Christian sects of the Appalachian Mountains. All right, so these are the kinds of research questions then that would get asked. And as you go through these research questions, think about the researcher roles, right? What would be the researcher roles and what would be the audience roles with these questions? So who are these people? Who are these Christian sects, right? What do they do? How do they do it? What happens in a snake handling service? Why do they do it? How does the practice deepen their experience of community? How are they depicted by others in the media? And you can see how the questions are sort of progressing. So who are they? What do they do? What happens? Why do they do it? I mean, in some sense, this might be just, look, I'm telling you something new about this, right? But then they get more complicated. How does the practice deepen their experience of the community? How are they depicted by others and the media? And now it seems to be entering into the sphere of, well, how should we understand this better? Perhaps they've been stigmatized by the media, right? So how should we understand them in a different way such that they're no longer stigmatized by the media? How many snake handlers actually get hurt or die? Are they doing it willingly? Are they of age? Where do they get the snakes? How are the snakes kept, right? So these are the kinds of questions that are being asked. So do the same, like whatever topic you're working on. write out some research questions for yourself like that. And then as you and it doesn't really matter what order you write them in, just sort of brainstorm, write out, all kinds of questions that you could think about your own topic. And then go back to this chart and try to say, okay, well, which questions appeal to which roles here, or who is my imagined audience when I'm asking these questions. Okay, so that's a good place to start. You've got sort of a germ of a topic in your mind. So then just ask as many questions, just write down as many questions as you can think about it, and then try to organize your questions according to this chart to see exactly who you decide, what you decide your researcher role is going to be, or how maybe one or more of these roles, how these more of these roles are going to overlap. Okay, and who your audience is.